All right. Well, I've been asked to just say a few words of welcome. My name is Adele Lindenmeyer. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and also a proud member of the Russian Area Studies Concentration faculty with background in Russian history. Professor Alexandrov and I actually first met a few years ago in graduate school. We were together in graduate school at Princeton University in a fabulous graduate seminar on Dostoevsky. So I'm thrilled to welcome him to Villanova this afternoon virtually. I'd much rather have it be in person. I highly regard his work. Loved the book Black Russian when it came out, I think 6 years ago now.
Yeah.
And so I'm very excited to welcome such an original and productive and distinguished scholar to Villanova.
Thank you, Adele. Thank you, buddies, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure for me to visit virtually and to tell you a little bit about the Black Russian.
Excuse me, Vladimir. I just wanted to do some introduction.
Oh, okay.
And then you will continue.
Then I'll stop my stopwatch.
Okay, if you don't mind. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Alexandrov, B.E. Messenger, Professor Emeritus at Yale University. Professor Alexandrov grew up in New York, attended Queens College and City College, had a degree, a master's degree in geology, in the science, but then he pursued a PhD degree in Russian literature. After completing his PhD, he taught at Harvard and then at Yale University. And really, for more than 30 years, he has been professor of Russian literature at Yale. And he's a leading scholar in Russian literature. He authored groundbreaking books on Russian classics such as Andrei Bely, Vladimir Nabokov, more recently Lev Tolstoy, and so on. And then relatively recently, something changed his life, as he put it. Vladimir became interested and started research on Frederick Bruce Thomas, the son of Mississippi slaves who spent 20 years in Russia and then becoming a millionaire, a Russian millionaire and owner of restaurants, nightclubs in Moscow. And the result of this research is the fascinating book of the extraordinary life of Frederick Bruce Thomas. It was applauded by critics. It was named one of top 10 best books in the year it was published, received numerous awards. So we're welcome Dr. Alexandrov, and he will continue Thank you.
Thank you, Boris, for your very kind words. Yes, so working on this topic, writing this book changed my life, which is also why I like revisiting how that happened in talks like this one. So as Boris mentioned, I used to teach Russian literature and culture, and I was preparing a seminar on interwar Russian emigre culture, and I decided to include in it a unit dedicated to a very popular Russian singer in the 19-teens, 1920s, and later by the name of Alexander Vertinsky. He is still popular in Russian circles now in Russia as well as in the diaspora. And Vertinsky described in his memoir how he escaped from the south of Russia in 1920 to get away from the Bolsheviks who were winning the Civil War to Constantinople, which was a safe haven. It's what Istanbul used to be called, because Istanbul, Constantinople was under the control of the victorious Allies, and Turkey was a defeated country. And then there was a sentence that is the focal point of what happened to me. I'll translate for you from the original Russian using the locutions that Vertinsky used. He said, I began to perform when I got to Constantinople in the outdoor entertainment garden of our famous Moscow Negro, Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas, the owner of the famous Maxim in Moscow. Now that sentence in the original Russian so surprised me that I remember closing the book and putting it down. I knew something about the period and the culture of Russia at that time. I'd never heard of any famous Black people in Moscow. I'd never heard of what Maxim was either. I knew that Black people of any kind, whether from the United States, the Caribbean, or directly from Africa, were very rare in Imperial Russia for historical reasons. In fact, if you were to ask an average educated Russian today to name the most famous Black person in Russian imperial history, meaning prior to 1917, they would certainly mention Abram Ganibal. And he's known because he was the direct ancestor of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's national writer, but he lived in the first 2/3 of the 18th century, which means that there were no other famous Black people in Russian imperial history through the rest of the 18th and into the 19th. So in other words, this sentence in Vertinsky's memoir intrigued me, and I decided to research it. I began locally, dug through Yale's rich libraries, found very little, and what I found out about him was very contradictory, but by then I was hooked. I also had one of these gifts that we academics are sometimes given, a year-long sabbatical. And I decided that I wasn't going to rest until I found out who this man was. So I did research in various American archives, especially the National Archives in and outside of Washington, D.C. I worked in a couple of French archives. I worked in the National Archives in London, in several archives in Moscow. By proxy, I worked in archives in Rotterdam and in Buenos Aires. If the people that I asked to look into the archives there had found anything of any value, I would have been out there myself on the first flight. And at the end of about a year or more of pretty serious digging, I discovered quite a bit about my enigmatic Black Russian owner of Maxim, which turned out to be a theater/nightclub in Moscow. And as Boris mentioned, his real name was Frederick Bruce Thomas. And he was the son of former slaves in Mississippi, in Coahoma County, where he was born on the family farm in 1872. Now, the research that I had carried out, including in Coahoma County itself in Mississippi and the Chancery Court records there, convinced me that he got his wings in life, by which I mean the ability to become a successful impresario in Moscow and then in Constantinople. He got those wings from his parents, who were remarkable people. They were slaves until 1865. After that, they probably worked as sharecroppers, which is what happened to most of the Black people who were liberated after the Civil War ended. But in 1869, Frederick Thomas's father bought at auction for $20 a 200-acre tract of land in Coahoma County that included forest, waterways, I'll explain that later, as well as farmland. Now, even with the depressed currency in post-war Mississippi, this was a very cheap price, and he got to pay it off over a period of 3 years. Now, he and his wife were obviously very skilled farmers already, because in the 1870 census that was produced immediately after they obtained this farm, the data that was recorded show that their entire farm holding was evaluated at $5,000 in 1870 dollars, which means that they managed to multiply their investment several hundred times over and immediately became one of the leading Black families in the entire county of Coahoma. There were maybe 260 farms or plots of land that were owned by different people in Coahoma at this time. Very few of them were owned by Black people. Theirs was the second largest. So they began to stand out in economic terms. Not only did they produce the inevitable cotton, corn, and other things on their farm, they also branched out into lumber production, so that Frederick's father hired as a partner an English emigrant to start up a sawmill. The other striking thing about the family is that they obviously had a very strongly developed social conscience. In 1879, in other words, a decade after they obtained the farm, which, by the way, over time they increased in size from 200 acres to a maximum of 600 acres by buying or leasing more land. In 1879, Frederick and his second wife, a woman named India, who raised my subject, who was born on that farm in 1872 and whom he thought of as his mother, they sold for the token sum of $1 an acre of their farmland to found an African Methodist Episcopal church. As far as I was able to ascertain, this may have been only the second AME church in Coahoma County after the mother church in Rivertown called Friars Point. Now, as you know, churches well into the 20th century served various functions in Black Southern communities. They were not just places of worship. There were also places where children were taught. There were places for gathering for social and political reasons. And India, my subject's stepmother, was literate, which was also unusual. My supposition is that the rudiments of an education that he had before he left the South were partially gained in this church that also served as a schoolhouse. Now, this meant that the Thomas family stood out. And when Reconstruction ended in the South and the Black population was again subjected to the oppressions of the white power structure that took over, the Thomases became a prime target. In 1886, a rich local planter who owned much more land than anyone else in the county, as well as all other kinds of real property in the local towns, concocted a plot to steal the Thomas farm from them. Why? Probably because he thought he could get away with it. This is where the Thomas family again showed a characteristic trait that I think their son inherited from them, in that they took this man to court. And they won the case on the local level. This was such an outrage that the white planter appealed the local court's decision to the Mississippi Supreme Court, where the case dragged on with various twists and turns for another half dozen years. But by now, the Thomas family had obviously wronged the white power establishment in Coahoma County. despite the fact that they had had decent relationships with them before Reconstruction ended. And to get out of harm's way, the Thomases left what was left of their farm because they had to sign part of it over to a powerful local white lawyer who fought on their side in a lawsuit against the white planter. They moved to Memphis. By this point, this is 1890. My subject, Frederick, is 18 years old, and this was his first taste of urban life. He began to work in an upscale food store as a delivery boy. He also attended a formal normal school for a period of time. And then another tragedy after the lawsuit hit the Thomas family. His father, Louis, was killed by a tenant. When I first came, because they ran a boarding house in Memphis, the Thomas family, at first I thought that I would be able to find some kind of a trace connecting this murder to the planter back in Coahoma who had it in for the Thomas family, but I don't think that was the case. I think it was simply really bad luck. Louis Thomas, my subject's father, was a very decent man by all accounts. He intervened in a domestic quarrel, and the price he paid for this was to be murdered. The family fell apart at this point, and my Frederick Thomas decided to leave the South. After this, he began to break the mold for young Black men in the United States because he went north. This was a considerable period of time before the Great Migration happened, which was mostly after the First World War. There were Black populations at this time in northern cities, but they were very small. Nonetheless, Thomas first went to Chicago, where he acquired what proved to be very portable skills. He became a waiter, and he started to work as a waiter in a very upscale place. I'll show a slide of it later on. It was the newest and fanciest hotel in Chicago called the Auditorium. Excuse me. It was built in preparation for the World's Fair of 1893 and was a very desirable place to work. He stayed in Chicago for a number of years, after which he decided to go someplace else in the north, and he moved to Brooklyn, which at that point was not yet part of New York City. The population, by the way, the Black population of the greater New York City area at that time, around 1893, 1894, was between 1% and 2%, if I'm not mistaken. So again, there were very few Black people still at this point in these northern cities. There were greater freedoms for young Black men like him in the North than there had been in the South, but obviously there was still severe restrictions as well. And in Brooklyn, Thomas added another skill set to his being a good waiter, which was that he became a valet to a powerful, rich businessman who dealt with variety theaters. Thomas himself, when he was a valet, also managed to get a job as the head bellboy in a leading hotel in Brooklyn. So again, although the range of possibilities for him as a young Black man in the North was restricted, he managed to get himself to the top of the available range of possible positions. He also had a passion at this time, which was music. As far as I can ascertain, it was probably singing. He took lessons from a German immigrant teacher who worked in Manhattan, and it was that man who suggested to him that he should continue his musical education, but he should go to Europe for that purpose because there was a color line in musical conservatories in the United States. The German teacher thought there wouldn't be one that Thomas would encounter in Western Europe. And so he up and went. In 1894, he shipped out to England. It was very easy to travel internationally in those days. You didn't even need a passport. And his arrival in London redefined him. He did not pursue a musical career for reasons that I was never able entirely to pin down. He was always a very determined young man, so if he had really wanted to, he probably would have found a way. What he did instead was to rely on the skills he had developed in the United States. And for the next 5 years, he lived in various European countries, going from England to France to Germany to Italy, back to France, finding work everywhere as a waiter or as a valet. He must have been very good at what he was doing, because for one season in 1896, he became the head waiter in a good French resort hotel on the Riviera. In other words, he was put in charge of native local French and Italian waiters. He picked up languages very quickly. His French became so good that a visiting American who saw him in action thought that he would be indistinguishable from a Parisian. He picked up a fair amount of German, and he was on his way to Italy to learn Italian when he stopped to work for a while in Monte Carlo. And that's where fate changed again. I should mention, of course, that he was way ahead of the wave of expatriations by American Black people to Western Europe by going there in 1894. Again, this kind of movement of expatriates happened for the most part after the First World War. So he was some good 20 years ahead of that curve. In Monte Carlo, he apparently caught the eye of a visiting Russian nobleman. Now, who that nobleman was varied with Thomas's recollections. Sometimes he would say that it was a Grand Duke, which is what Russians called the sons and grandsons of Russian emperors. Be that as it may, whoever this man was, took him, Thomas, with him to St. Petersburg, where Thomas worked for a while as the man's valet. And then he decided to take off on his own. He traveled through the country at first, from St. Petersburg to Odessa at the south on the Black Sea, and then to Moscow. Russia at this point in her history had practically no Black people of any kind living there. In Moscow, around 1910, the population was somewhere around 1.5 million. My estimate is that there probably were no more than a dozen Black people in Moscow, most of them working in the horse racing business, which was very popular and was a place to which American Black people could go because of the color line in the United States that required them to look for some other place to practice their craft. There was, for example, a Black jockey who won the Kentucky Derby twice in the first decade of the 20th century, Jimmy Winkfield, who moved to Russia because he could not succeed in his craft any longer in the US, but the Russians were willing to hire him. Another thing to mention here in connection with that is that 2/3 of the Russian Empire lay in Asia, and Russia was a multi-ethnic empire. Moscow was a city that had visitors, according to tourist guides of the time, from the Black Sea Basin, from Central Asia, from Siberia. In other words, it wasn't a homogeneously white and, as they say, round-eyed place at all. And so, although Thomas statistically was a considerable rarity in Moscow by being a Black person, in fact, he didn't stand out as much as one may have thought. And he encountered no color line in Moscow at all. He began to work his way up from the restaurant floor as a waiter. Then he became a head waiter. By 1910, he became the assistant, in other words, more than a head waiter, but less than the owner, an assistant to the owner of one of the fanciest restaurants in the entire Russian Empire, Yar, which still exists in a kind of abridged form and which has a very long history going back to the 19th century. And he apparently was so successful in his job that he got such good tips that he was able to accumulate a big enough sum that, together with 2 other Russians who had worked their way up from the restaurant floor, they decided to lease a failed entertainment garden in the center of Moscow called Aquarium. These kinds of entertainment gardens were very popular everywhere in Europe. Think of it as kind of a Disney World for adults, or maybe Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, a plot of land, several acres with trees, walkways, theaters, gazebos, attractions of various kinds, restaurants, places to drink. The place still exists in Moscow, incidentally, the Park Aquarium that Thomas and his partners took over in 1911. And they made such a success of it that each of them had a net income in today's money of about $1 million after their first season. This was a spectacular success. Thomas immediately plowed his share into another property that he owned by himself, also in the center of Moscow. It's a 20-minute walk from the Kremlin to this place, which he called Maxim. The building has been rebuilt, but the location is still clear. So Thomas was doing very well economically in a way that would have been inconceivable for him in the United States. He had a personal life as well. He married a young German woman who was living in Moscow. They had 3 very handsome children. I'll show you a picture of them later on. Unfortunately, she died from pneumonia, which was a scourge of those times, in 1910. He then married the nanny that they had hired to help with the children as a second wife. That was not a very happy marriage, as a result of which Thomas started an affair with a beautiful young German performer at the Aquarium Theater that was part of his property. He had 2 more children with her. In 1914, during the summer, Thomas reached out to Jack Johnson, who was the heavyweight champion of the world in boxing in the United States and who had run into ghastly problems with racist whites in the United States. Thomas reached out to him in a sense of inviting him to come to Moscow to put on exhibition boxing matches, which was a very innovative move because there was no professional boxing in Russia at the time. And my impression is that Thomas was hoping to start it up from scratch. The only reason these fights were not put on, because Johnson did come to Moscow, is that the Great War began in the summer of 1914. Thomas thrived during the war. The Russian government imposed prohibition, and it succeeded in Russia when the war began just about as well as prohibition would succeed in the United States when it would be instituted half dozen or so years later. Thomas, like every other canny entertainment purveyor, sold liquor illegally. He made so much money that he was able to buy a villa in Odessa, which will play a role in his life later on. And by the time that 1917 rolled around, he invested in a block of apartments in the center of Moscow as a place to park the money that he was making. So Thomas's life was constantly improving from around 1900 to 1917. But the country that he adopted and that adopted him, and he actually became a citizen of the Russian Empire. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The curve of the life of the country, of Russia, of the Russian Empire, was constantly plummeting. The period from 1900 to 1917 saw terrorist attacks, strikes, the revolution of 1905 that involved cannon fire in the center of Moscow. The Great War is something that weakened the Russian Empire even more. The empire wasn't ready for it. It suffered grievous losses, more than any of the other countries in the Entente, in other words, in the alliance of Great Britain, France, and Russia. And so by 1917, by early 1917, the country was falling apart at the seams, resulting in what the Russians call the February Revolution. By the calendar used in the West, it was in March. The emperor abdicated. Civilian government was instituted. The country began to change overnight. Thomas survived this. He adapted his entertainment business to the new populist interests of the first revolution. But when the Bolsheviks had their coup d'etat in November of 1917, Thomas woke up to discover that he was on the wrong side of history. The Bolsheviks didn't care that Thomas had been an oppressed member of a minority in the United States. All that mattered to them was he was a rich Muscovite, as a result of which he was threatened. His properties were nationalized. He found out that he was on a list in early 1918 to be arrested, and to escape what he feared would be execution, and executions were meted out by the Soviets in the early months very readily. He escaped to the south, and he went to Odessa, where he had a villa, which for various historical reasons was at that point in time in the hands of the Germans, and then when the war ended, in the hands of the French. So lots of others from the north of Russia traveled to the south, to the shore of the Black Sea, to Odessa and other places to escape the Bolsheviks. The Allies tried to help anti-Bolshevik military units that were forming in the south of Russia, and everyone's hopes, including Thomas's, were that these anti-Bolshevik armies that the Allies were funding and supporting would fight their way to the north and throw the Bolsheviks out. It didn't happen, of course. And by 1919, Odessa was threatened by advancing Red Bolshevik forces. So Thomas had to flee again with his family. He managed to get himself onto a ship and went to Constantinople, which I had mentioned early on, was a safe haven for people like him from the Bolsheviks who was under the control of victorious allies. He landed in Constantinople in the spring of 1919, as he remembered, with about $25 in his pocket. The total value of his properties in Moscow was somewhere on the order of about 10 million in today's dollars, according to the various calculations that I went through, and he had to abandon it all. But he landed in Constantinople with a unique skill set that really fit the time and place. The victorious allies took over the city. Excuse me. They were planning to dismember pretty much the Ottoman Empire, which they then proceeded to do. And it meant that the city itself, Istanbul, Constantinople, was filled with thousands at least, probably several tens of thousands, of French, British, Italian, and American soldiers, sailors, businessmen, and entrepreneurs. Mostly men, of course. And what they wanted more than anything was wine, women, and song. And Thomas knew how to organize those kinds of entertainments because that's what he had done in Russia. And so he rented a piece of land on the outskirts of the city, took out loans at usurious rates, 100% for 6 months, and started up an entertainment garden, which is where that singer that I began with first performed when he landed in Constantinople the following year in 1920. Thomas struggled mightily initially. He incurred debts. The people that he owed money kept bothering him and the Americans in Constantinople to get him to pay. Eventually, over time, he managed to climb out of his debts and became solvent. He had constant problems, however, with the Americans in Constantinople. He tried to get their assistance when he was in trouble by presenting himself as an American citizen, which he obviously had been. He didn't have any papers, however. He said he didn't have any papers because he claimed that they had been stolen from him in Bolshevik Russia. The truth of the matter was, and he concealed this from the Americans in Constantinople, and I was able to discover it by triangulating various archival forms of evidence, is that he in 1915 had given up his American citizenship in Russia and become a citizen of the Russian Empire. You could not be a dual citizen in those days. So the Americans denied him citizenship primarily, or let's put it even more strongly, exclusively for racist reasons. I'll give you one concrete example before going on with his story. He applied to receive an American passport. He filled out the forms that were necessary, and they were sent to the State Department in Washington, D.C. The response from the State Department to the Consulate General in Constantinople, where he had made his application, was that we have no evidence that this man was ever a citizen of the United States. This was a lie, because when I went to look in the same State Department archives, a century later, I found several dozen documents, contemporaneous ones from starting in 1893 and going up through 1917, that showed that Thomas had systematically renewed at various points his American citizenship, I should say through 1915, which is when he became a Russian citizen. So the State Department at that time was actually a notoriously racist and anti-Semitic establishment, and they simply didn't want to deal with a Black American who had been amazingly successful in the Russian Empire and who now arrived in Constantinople, trailing almost a kind of a legendary story behind him, and with a white wife and a handful of mixed race children to boot. Thomas was able to ignore the fact that the Americans didn't want any part of him for a while. He opened another Maxim, as he had in Moscow, in a central location near Taksim Square. If any of you know Istanbul at all, it's right in the heart of the city. It became the toast of Istanbul. When tourism to the Mediterranean basin returned after the Great War, starting in 1920 and so on, Constantinople became a stop, an obligatory one for people doing a tour of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the things that the tourists routinely wanted to see was, of course, Hagia Sophia, the 15th century church that had been made into a mosque, the Grand Bazaar, which still exists too, and Maxims, because prohibition was enforced in the United States, and Maxims, owned by Frederick Thomas in Istanbul, had become famous for its jazz, which he imported to Turkey, and for its really excellent barmen and the drinks that you could get there. So money began to roll in, and Thomas became rich and famous again. But then once again, the earth moved under his feet. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal successfully finished expelling foreign invaders in Turkey and proclaimed a republic. The allies who had been in charge of the city had to leave, and the Turkish Republic was proclaimed. With that, the kinds of privileges that foreigners had been given under the Ottoman Empire disappeared, and Thomas was left high and dry, without American papers, without Russian papers, with no citizenship whatsoever. He managed to survive for a few more years, apparently by using Turkish partners to shield his stateless person from the eyes of the Turkish Republic. But other people began to compete with him in the kind of activities that he excelled in. He tried to compete in turn by opening a bigger and fancier place than the one that had succeeded. He overextended himself. The result of that was that he incurred debts, and he had no place to turn for help. I might mention that although officially the State Department would not help him or recognize him, there were Americans who were willing to try, not successfully, however. Even the most senior, high-ranked American in the city, Admiral Mark Bristol, who was the head of the naval flotilla in the city, as well as being the de facto American ambassador to the new Turkey, intervened on his behalf. But it didn't help. He didn't get the kind of recognition from the Americans that would have helped him survive the economic problems he was having. In the end, he had to run. He went to Ankara, the new capital that was being built in the central part of the country by the leader of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal. He tried to start a new business there. It didn't work. He was arrested and put into debtor's prison in Istanbul. They took him back. He had been sick with pneumonia several times before. He contracted it again. And when he was near death, an order of charitable nuns in the city, Catholic nuns, took him in, and he died in their hospital in 1927, in July. By this point in time, he was destitute and his family was ruined. Life for them was very difficult. The only one of his children who managed to get out of this problem was his oldest son, Mikhail, who had gone to Prague to study because the new Czech Republic was very hospitable to Thomas. So his life ended on a tragic note. But rather than my ending my story on that note, I want to touch a little bit on how I did some of my research about him. One of my sources of information about Thomas was Thomas's grandson, Bruce Thomas, a Frenchman whom I managed to track down in a very amusing way through the grandson's ex-wife, whose name is Chantal Thomas, and who is the head of a very successful chain of French lingerie stores in France, as well as in various other places around the world. To make a long story short, I was able to visit Bruce Thomas, the grandson, in Paris at the beginning of my research. He was very hospitable. He was about my own age, and he told me what he knew about his grandfather's life story. I recorded all this with his permission and then revisited the grandson after doing my research in various archives and libraries in 5 countries. And what I had discovered was that most of what the grandson knew about his grandfather was sheer invention. And I'll give you a couple of examples. But it's invention that has a kind of a point to it, and I'll come back to that. So according to the grandson, his grandfather was the son of a chief of Native Americans in the Southwest in what is now New Mexico, the so-called Tomac tribe, which was spelled T-O-M-A-C. I subsequently realized that if you read T-O-M-A-C as Cyrillic, it reads Thomas. According to the grandson, the son of the Native American chieftain wound up going to Mexico, shipping out of Veracruz, and going to Rotterdam, where he received training as merchant seaman. I know from various evidence that really is quite incontrovertible what I told you, that Thomas went to the north from his home in Coahoma County, worked his way up from the restaurant floor, and all the rest of what I described. I described to you how he got to Russia by being brought there by a rich visitor to Monte Carlo. According to the grandson, his grandfather, as a merchant seaman, engaged in smuggling in the South China Sea. And how did he get to Russia? He was in a bar in Shanghai, and he saved a rich visiting Russian's life, as a result of which the rich Russian took him back to Moscow and set him up in grand style. Other aspects of what the grandson knew about his grandfather were pretty close to the truth, but some basic elements were not. However, this was not a random invention. And the invention actually originates with the son, Mikhail, whom I mentioned, the one who went to study in Prague, because by the late 1930s, he made it to Paris, and then he spent the rest of his life in Paris. He died in Paris in 1987. The grandson was born in Paris around 1947. He never knew his grandfather, who died in 1927. And what I think the son of Frederick Bruce Thomas, Michael or Mikhail, did is the kind of invention that is not rare in some Black families. I've read things that the eminent scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. has written about this. He's done studies of Black ancestry using DNA analysis. And his conclusion is that stories of a non-Black ancestor in American Black families are more prevalent than the DNA evidence would suggest. And why would this be the case? Because it takes some of the onus off of people having to completely acknowledge the fact that some of their ancestors were enslaved. So I think, based on this kind of scholarship that was done by others, this must have been what happened to Thomas as well. So I came back to Paris a couple of times. After that, I visited Thomas. I brought him the evidence that I had found. When the book was published, I gave him a copy. I don't know how he managed it. He doesn't know English. We communicated in French. I can get by in it, although it's not the easiest thing for me. But it was disappointing for him, of course. He said to me that the story that I had dismantled about his grandfather is one that he, the grandson, Bruce, had used to win the hands of both women that he married. The wife that I met was his second wife. This lingerie designer was Chantal. And so I had undermined the basis of his otherwise happy marriage. He was kidding, of course. He took it as disappointing evidence of some kind of a distance between himself and his father, who didn't tell him the truth about the family's origin. But to make up for it, Bruce Thomas wrote a novel called Tomac ou l'Indien de Moscou, Tomac or the Indian from Moscow, where he told the oral version that he had grown up with. So that is an overview of Thomas's life. There's more that I could say about all of it, but I thought that it might be nice now to show you some of the images that I've prepared that illustrate various aspects of Thomas's life, as well as pictures of him, so that you could see what the man looked like. So why don't I move to that now? And I hope that everybody can see the first slide. Yes? Okay. I give my website at the very bottom because it has a lot of information that I couldn't get to in my remarks, or even things that are not in the book itself. So the first thing I wanted to do is to show you, using stock photos, these are not from his time, obviously, of what that part of Coahoma County looked like. It was known as the Delta, but it's not, of course, the Delta in the sense of where the river, the Mississippi River, empties out into the Gulf of Mexico, which is several hundred miles away. It was called the Delta because of the annual spring floods from the Mississippi River and from the Yazoo, which is there as well. This made working the land very difficult, as we'll see, but it also made it incredibly productive and arable. The work of clearing the land was, of course, done in the 19th century by slaves prior to their emancipation. And it was backbreaking work. You saw what the swamp looked like. Those swamps had to be drained. The thick forests had to be cleared. The swampy areas were breeding grounds for mosquitoes, so that epidemics swept through regularly, decimating the population, especially children, and especially Black children. But the end result of it was that the earth was so rich from the annual floods that cotton grew in this part of Mississippi to twice its size elsewhere in the South. Just another stock photo of the kind of farming procedures that would have gone on, not Thomas's family, but from the Library of Congress. And the end result was this: enormous amounts of cotton, so that Coahoma County and Mississippi in general, I think, produced something like 1/4 of all the cotton that the South shipped, that the United States shipped to England prior to the Civil War, which made the planters very rich, but at the expense of the backbreaking labor of the Black slaves who did the actual work. I mentioned that Thomas left the South in 1890 and wound up in Chicago. This is the Auditorium Hotel. It's now Roosevelt University on South Michigan Avenue. It was the fanciest hotel in the country at the time, and it means a lot that Thomas was able to get a job as a waiter there, rather than any of scores of other Chicago restaurants. One can go into the building, and one can see the library, which is at the top floor, but which was originally the dining room. Little of the actual original interior has been preserved, but some has, and it was very interesting for me to see the actual setting where Thomas worked. So as I said, this room is now on the top floor. It's now the library. This is Thomas, I think in Paris, around 1896. Good-looking man. Here's another picture of him that shows him to even better advantage. This was given to me by his grandson in Paris, who, as I said, was very hospitable. Thomas was handsome. It helped him in his work. He was very outgoing, lots of memoirs, stress, the hearty welcome that he would extend to his patrons, either when he was still a waiter or a maître d'hôtel, or when he became an owner. This is, again, a contemporary photograph of the place in Monte Carlo where he worked, the Hôtel de Paris. This is what it looks like now, the same as it did when he was there at the end of the 19th century. It faces the casino and was also a very swanky place to work. This is an early 1900 photo of Moscow. You can see in the center top the Kremlin with Ivan the Great bell tower. It was a very low-lying city. Very few buildings above 2 or 3 stories high, just a few in the middle. Another view of the Kremlin on the left, St. Basil's Cathedral on the right center, taken from across the river, again showing that it was a 2 or 3 story tall building, city for the most part. A central street showing what that looked like. Churches were everywhere. A lot of them are gone. They were destroyed by the Soviets in the 1930s. When Thomas was running his nightclub on Maxim on Bolshaya Dmitrovka Street, there were 3 churches around his building that he had trouble with because there were restrictions on what kinds of secular and i.e. frivolous entertainments could be put on when churches were so close by. But he managed to work his way around that problem. And as I said, all those churches were destroyed by the Soviets in the 30s. I mentioned that he became the assistant to the owner of Yar. You can see at the bottom the size of people to get a sense of the scale of this building. In those days, when you arrived at a swanky place, you had to be made to feel that you had arrived someplace special. And they did this with architectural excess. Very high ceilings, luxurious decorations. This is the restaurant that the notorious Rasputin, the so-called monk, although he wasn't really a monk, who was a malevolent influence on the Russian imperial family, would come to when he wanted to carouse in Moscow, a place that it took a lot of money to be able to enjoy. And this is where Thomas rose to considerable prominence. I love this photograph. When my book came out, some people in Moscow whose ancestors had connections with Thomas got in touch with me to say that they had photographs. Very few survived. These people said that their parents and grandparents had more, but destroyed them in the 1930s when the Stalinist terror was sweeping the country. Because if you had photographs of the past or of life as it had once been, that would be enough for you to be suspected by the Soviet secret police. You could be arrested for it. So very few of these kinds of documents survived. So Thomas is obviously on the right. He's sitting with his 2 Russian partners. Tough cookies to look at them. Martynov and Tsaryov, as I said, both started at the ground level and worked their way up. They're in the aquarium garden at the beginning of the season, and the Borzoi is a wonderful sign of where, in fact, they are, since it's a famous Russian breed. This is the entrance to aquarium at that time. Again, a grand colonnade. It doesn't look anything like that now. It looks much more pedestrian, but people needed to be made to feel that they were arriving someplace special. And you could see some of the buildings inside the forested grounds. There were theaters that put on vaudeville, farces, operettas, light entertainment, nothing too heavy. Places where you could eat and drink, places where you could compete in bowling and other kinds of pastimes like that. It was a great success. This is from a theatrical journal showing the program at Maxim, the second place that Thomas opened, listing the various acts, which include Russian acts, a Black American act, a trio called Philadelphie. I don't know if that's their name or whether that's a corruption of Philadelphia. Also funny things like a performer of Eastern exotic dances, Mademoiselle Dasmarova. And Dasmarova, of course, is an egregiously Russian surname. So Russians would be pretending to be Easterners. It also worked the other way around. And Thomas. Try to remember that picture of him because it'll come up at the very end. This is an artist's impression of the interior of Maxim. I wasn't able to find actual photographs, but I found this. So you can see that well-dressed people are sitting at tables with buckets of chilled champagne on them. There's a red-jacketed band performing and some kind of a gypsy or Spanish dance being performed for their entertainment on the floor. A very swanky place. Thomas and his family with his second wife, the woman on the left, Valentina. The three children are the ones he had by his first wife, Hedvig. Judging by how lovely they are, she must have been very pretty, but I wasn't able to find photographs of her. I don't know who the two men are. I suspect that they were relatives of Valentina's, his second wife. That was not a happy marriage because he met this woman, a German singer and dancer. This is a publicity photo from about 1910. She was well enough known in Germany for the Gerlach company that produced hundreds of these kinds of things for collectors to produce a picture of her showing how pretty she was. But her act was actually also more demure. It turns out that cowboy acts by Germans were very popular at this time, starting in the 19th century. And she and two others had a cowboy act that was put on in Thomas's aquarium theater, which is where they met. I mentioned that Thomas imported Jack Johnson to Russia. Here's a Russian poster announcing the fact that beginning on the 15th of July, there would be exhibition boxing matches at the aquarium. 15th July, of course, is according to the old Russian calendar, which would be the 28th of July, according to the new calendar that was then used in the West, like Germany or the United States. That meant right when the First World War broke out, which is why Johnson did not stay to put on his exhibition matches, but quickly went back to Western Europe because the front lines were going to extend all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and he didn't want to get trapped in Russia. The only way out then would have been through Siberia and Asia. This is a photograph of the document signed or marked in 1915 by Nicholas II. It says in the upper left-hand corner, in his hand in blue pencil, agreed, or I agree. And that is part of a petition for Thomas and about 120 other people to become subjects of the Russian Empire. As far as I know, Thomas may have been the only, or certainly one of the very few, Black Americans to have become a citizen of the Russian Empire. These are two more photographs that were sent to me by people whose ancestors knew Thomas during his heyday, a century before, showing him in his prime as very successful in these studio photos, as I estimate around 1915. Well, as I said, When the Bolsheviks had him in their sights in 1918, he fled to the south. These are the iconic Richelieu steps in Odessa, the port city where he had a villa and from which he had to escape aboard this ship. It had been built as a comfortable passenger vessel prior to the war. When Thomas left in 1919, the vessel had something like 900 people on it, although it had been designed for 350. The conditions were hellish, but everybody wanted to get away from the Bolsheviks. And this is what Istanbul looked like then. The Asian side, not the Asian side, the old part of the city looks pretty much the same to this day, dominated by the grand domes of the mosques and the minarets. But Thomas settled in the western part of the city, then known as Pera. This is the Grande Rue de Pera. Now it's called İstiklal Caddesi. If you follow it all the way from closer to the water, you wind up in Taksim Square. It had European-style buildings, and that's where most of the foreigners to whom he catered either lived or spent their time. I have not been able to find a photograph of his outdoor entertainment garden, but this shows an artist's conception of it. And you can make out that there are civilians and military sitting with their backs to us at tables, looking up at a stage in the upper right where skimpily dressed performers dancing, and on the left is a bandstand with musicians. This was a seasonal venture, of course. Thomas needed someplace indoors for the cold winter season, but he was very successful. This is from a newspaper published in English in Constantinople, indicating that his operation, Maxim, he uses the old name Stella as well to connect to his past establishment, were treated very generously by the British occupiers of the city because the British allowed their officers and families to attend Thomas's enterprise. Archival photos of Elvira, the German singer and dancer who became his third wife, and Mikhail, the oldest son who went to study in Prague. This is a picture of Mikhail that his son, Bruce, in Paris never saw. So I made a copy of it and gave it to him as a kind of a peace offering. The two youngest boys that Thomas had by Elvira, their lives were very difficult when he died in Istanbul. This is the Catholic cemetery in Istanbul where Thomas was buried, but it's not known where because there was no money for any kind of a marker. This is the remnant of the Maxim nightclub that I found there in 2009. You can see it was transformed into a squalid parking garage. Some decorations in the ceiling remained, although this is long after Thomas had lost the property to his Turkish creditors. Now even this is gone. A fancy new hotel has been put up on the site. No commemoration of Thomas. When a book came out, another thing that I discovered is that Thomas had yet another affair with a woman in Moscow that I didn't know about. The little girl on the left, Lydia, was born to that woman. And when he left with his family for the south and then Constantinople, she stayed. And she had a successful life in Soviet Russia as a painter. The poster on the right shows what she looked like. This is a painting of hers that I especially like because it is her invention of an episode in her family's past. On the left is Thomas, as in the photograph on that poster. She never met him. Well, she never remembered him because she was 4 when he left the country. Sitting next to him is his then wife, and on the right is the little girl with her mother. It's a Russian Easter table setting, which is curious. That's a self-portrait by Lydia Fyodorovna Arkhipova, as she was known. There was an exhibit of her art in a Moscow museum just in February. And this is something from that museum, the Museum of the East. So that is what I had for you. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I see that something in the chat. Oh, it simply announces that there's a chance to ask questions if anybody would like to. So I am all ears.
Thank you, Vladimir. Well, there is my class also here. I think the class will end in a couple minutes, but maybe we can do some questions. It's in the form of chat or just oral.
Chat doesn't have anything in it, so it's going to have to be with some form of signaling.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So because he traveled to so many different countries, I was wondering how proficient he was in each language of the countries that he went to. Could he read and write in those languages as well as speak in them? And how did he learn, or was it just by living there?
Yeah, his French was very good. There's testimony to that fact. I found evidence that his German was quite good. His Russian was broken. He could speak
my
it.
Question.
Yeah, he could speak it quite glibly, but making all kinds of mistakes, because Russian is a highly inflected language. It's very difficult for people to keep all the cases and genders and things straight. But what helped him immensely was that he was fluent in French, and French was the second language of the world in those days, as English is now. So although he knew enough Russian, obviously, to be able to deal with his employees, and he had, I don't know, maybe 150 people working for him at Aquarium, dozens at Maxim, he obviously wouldn't have been speaking French to them all the time. So his Russian was glib, but flawed, but sufficient for his purposes. I don't know how well he could read and write it. Turkish, I think he simply knew a few phrases, but even more than in Russia, French was the second language of the Ottoman Empire. To the extent that when the Republic was proclaimed, one of the first things it did was to announce that business had to be conducted not in French, but in Turkish, and that signs and various enterprises had to be put up in Turkish. And if in a foreign language, it had to be a smaller font than the Turkish. But I don't think he knew more than a few colloquial phrases from what I can gather.
Thank you.
Another question that you didn't ask, but that I'm reminded of, is the issue of race. We know about the sorry history of Jim Crow in the United States, which Thomas escaped. In Western Europe, he didn't encounter a color line, interestingly enough, except when he ran into American tourists. American tourists would go to Western Europe and then write angry letters to their hometown provincial newspapers, someplace in Ohio or Mississippi, for example, and say, you're not going to believe what I saw in Paris or London. There was a ball, or there was a nice restaurant, and there was a black man having dinner or dancing with a white woman, and nobody seemed to care. So American tourists brought their racism with them in their luggage. But Thomas himself and other black people who went in the late 1890s, like Ida Wells, a very famous person who went to try to raise support for stopping lynching in the United States, and others, were able to breathe a kind of a sigh of relief once they wound up in Western Europe because of the absence of anti-black racism. The Europeans varied. The Brits were terrible racists with regard to South Asians, and they were anti-Semites, but they weren't anti-black. In Russia, the situation was even more flexible. As I indicated, there were no black people in Russia to speak of. Russia was a multi-ethnic empire. But if you were Jewish in Russia, it was a whole different story. So race and religion were issues, but not in a way that affected Thomas. The Ottoman Empire was colorblind. They didn't even divide the world according to racial categories. They divided it according to religion. So for an Ottoman Turk, what mattered is is the person that I'm dealing with a Muslim or not? And if the person was a Christian, didn't make any difference who he or she was married to. There was not even a specific word for a black person as we have in the United States, as I understand it, in the Turkish language. So Thomas went through very different worlds in terms of racial categories, or the categories by which the people among whom he lived divided the world up. And then the long arm of American racism reached him in Istanbul via those diplomats who wouldn't help him. All right, yeah, you're muted.
Lynn has a question.
Okay. Vincent, I thought had his hand up too, but I'll try to be really quick. First of all, I adored the book. I've assigned it to my class, and I'm hoping that they're enjoying it as much as I am. So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
As you were talking, though, I was thinking about this idea about a lack of a color line, and yet I'm struck by the sense of identity. And as you writing this biography of this man, I'm struck by how the task that you had, because this notion of finding his identity despite his penchant for rewriting his history to fit the situation. And I'm just wondering if you ever got the sense that there was, this attitude towards him as being indicative of the exotic, right? That he was not of this place. And as he moved from place to place, he was always the outsider, always the foreigner, always able to identify himself by this, often romantic tale like his grandson spun to you. And I was wondering if you could just comment on that a little bit, if you saw indications of that or not.
No, I did. Not from anything specific that he left. I did find letters that he wrote and other documents pertaining to him, but from recollections by other Black men who were in Paris at around the same time that he was, and comments about how Black men were perceived in Paris made by American journalists who were there. And the exotic emerged, but in a way that was attractive. French women found Black men attractive and interesting because they stood out. So even on the level of servants or shop girls, there was fascination in Black servants that arrived with white employers from the United States on the part of shop girls and maids, for example. In Russia, in all of the journals and things that I read about him that had been published during his lifetime, I found a couple of references to him as being Black. None of them was really negative. They were identifiers. But there would be constant comments about Thomas this or Thomas and Company is the way that he and his three partners were referred to often, because he was the more prominent of the three. It didn't seem to be that much of an issue. He himself would subsequently reminisce when he was in Constantinople and talking to a visiting American that there was no color line in Russia. I suspect that despite the fact that there were dark-skinned people from Central Asia in Moscow when he was there, that they probably still were noticeable. But I'll give you an example from Claude McKay, who was an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance, went to Russia really early, like about 1923, and published a couple of very revealing articles about his experience. He was a Black man, and he went there because he wanted to see what a supposedly colorblind society was like, which the Soviets presented themselves as being. And he was a poet, and he remembered that the poets that he interacted with kept asking him, why do you keep harking about racial issues and the color of your skin? We've got plenty of people around whose skin is darker than yours. What we care about is what kind of poetry you're writing. So I project that back onto the time when Thomas was there, because it's only 6 years after the revolution, meaning that it could not have been a completely irrelevant category for people, but it did not make him stand out. So, it's sort of a gesture and an answer to your question. Hi, Vincent.
Hi, thanks. And thanks so much for the fascinating presentation. I'm curious if you got a sense of whether Thomas had sort of political ideology beyond the sort of pragmatic, or whether he had a sense of solidarity with others who might be sort of outsiders in some way in the different contexts where he found himself.
Yeah, when I was still researching the book, I used to dream about Thomas, but he was always mute. I'd see him, but he would never say anything. And that's one of the questions that I have myself. There is some oblique evidence that sort of sheds some light on this. That gesture toward Jack Johnson is significant, I think. Jack Johnson was an international celebrity. He was known around the world. Russia was the odd country out in not having prize fighting. It was probably the most popular international sport during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And the fact that Johnson was being hounded in Chicago made the papers. And in fact, Thomas reached out to him in 1912. It took Jack Johnson 2 years to get to Moscow, but he did eventually. So I think that was indicative of the fact that Thomas was not indifferent to the plight of a prominent Black celebrity in the United States. There were Black performers who worked for Thomas in Moscow and in Constantinople. Some of them made comments about what that was like when they got home. I found some letters that they then wrote to Black newspapers, like the Chicago Defender or the Amsterdam News. And I get the sense that they felt that he had been welcoming to them. Was it in any special way? Was it more distinctive than his being welcoming to another performer? I can't say. When the First World War broke out, Thomas began to manifest all kinds of forms of Russian patriotism. He used his properties as staging areas for processions that would go through the city to demonstrate the population's loyalty to the regime, hatred for the Germans and the Austrians, and wishing victory for the Russian army. He organized campaigns and participated in them to gather money. There are reminiscences of him working crowds in Moscow, basically with a collection cup, to get money for the soldiers at the front. Was this all an act, or was it just good business? I don't know. When he petitioned to become a Russian citizenship, he had to use formulaic phrases. I have photographs of the petition. And of course, it expresses undying devotion to the Tsar and to Russia. Was that something he really felt, or was it just doing what was necessary to get what he wanted? He certainly succeeded in Moscow more than he had anywhere else in his life. He lived in Moscow longer than anywhere else except the family farm, and that's where he became himself. I mean, he arrived as a waiter with nothing much to his name, and when he had to escape, he was worth millions. He had been inducted into a superior kind of a group of Moscow merchants, the First Merchants Guild of Moscow, which was a prestigious appointment that carried certain perks with it, but mostly was something that made him feel part of the collective. Could he have gone through that and not felt some attachment? I doubt it, but I don't know for sure. Things like that is unfortunately all I could come up with. Maybe, somebody in an attic in Mississippi will find a box in which there are letters from Thomas that he wrote that have not been discovered until recently, where he'll tell us. I'm hoping more information about him will emerge because there are people in Istanbul who are interested in trying to commemorate him, including putting up a plaque in the French cemetery where he was buried, where we know he was buried there, but where is not known. I mentioned before we started out that there's a realistic chance that the book will be made into a TV series. If it does, that might shake some documents out of people's attics, or who knows. But it's nice for me to see that he remains a subject of interest after all this time. I started working on his book over a decade ago. It first came out in 2013. But people keep still being interested. Hi, Adele.
Hi, Vladimir. Thank you. This was it was great to, as it were, read the book again, but really hear more about your process of discovery as well. And there's nothing like doing a biography to make you feel like you're on a detective hunt.
Absolutely.
So I would like very much to hear your reflections on the craft of doing biography. What are the specific challenges? Not so much of this particular biography, but of biography as a genre. You mentioned that you dreamed of Thomas, but he wouldn't speak to you. I actually, having written a biography myself, I had the same experience. And so there certainly is that desire to communicate with your subject and not being able to do so. So just some reflections. And now you're writing a second biography, so you must really like this genre.
Yeah, I wish we could talk about this at much greater length, because you've raised an issue that's fascinating for us as practitioners. I've finished the second biography, and it's so vastly different from the first in terms of sources that I find it hard to generalize. Thomas was virtually completely forgotten when I came across him. There was that sentence in Virtinsky's memoir, and when I, as we all do when we discover something new that we want to learn more about, I Googled it. And what came up in the Russian search engine Yandex, because I entered it in Cyrillic, was the same sentence in Virtinsky's memoir. I found a couple of fragmentary allusions to Thomas's existence in English and in Russian. There is a very useful book by Alison Blakely called The Negro in Russia, I believe. It came out probably 20 years ago. He mentions Thomas, not by name because he didn't know the man's real name. So that was it. Whatever I was able to put into the book is stuff that I discovered in archives, which was very seductive, because when you go into an archive and you find a tiny little tidbit of something, you want more. And if you follow a string, it can lead to an entire cache of documents that you never suspected existed. So that was very compelling. There was relatively little secondary material about Thomas. He wasn't mentioned in memoirs all that much, only in some contemporary ones. He wasn't in histories. So I mention all of that because writing about Boris Savinkov, who is a legendary figure in Russian history, he's not known in the United States, but in Russia, if you Google his name, you'll get millions of hits on Yandex, was very different. I used some archival materials to supplement what I knew about his political life. I wanted to find out about his relations with family members, so that's the kind of archival stuff I focused on. But mostly it was trying to make sense of the plethora of conflicting views of him, because he elicited very different opinions from different people, triangulating them, trying to figure out who was more accurate, who was not. In Thomas's case, I frequently had no choice but to use whatever evidence I had, even if I suspected it might have been inaccurate, but I had to use it because there was no other choice, no other source. Or I would have to leave Thomas altogether and go to a somewhat more abstract level, such as I mentioned. What was it like for Thomas to be in London and Paris in the 1890s? I don't really know, but I know that other Black men were there and they felt X, Y, and Z. Therefore, I conclude it's likely, probably, that Thomas felt something along those lines as well. So that's the way in which I tried to fill in the gaps where possible. But of course, you always have to be really careful and not distort the source, whether it's from the subject you're writing about or from something related to it. I don't have any kind of generalizations about writing biography that I can make because the two books have been so vastly different. I wanted to try to understand the character as fully as I could in each case, what made him click, what the relation was between the individual and the historical context in which he lived, where his will was impacted by forces beyond his control, kind of thing. But that's generic, that's true for every biography, no matter what kind of a person you're writing about. I don't think I'm going to do another biography at this point. I think I've got my system for the time being.
Yeah, well, students left, but we can stay for another 5-10 minutes.
Sure, no, I'm happy to do that.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat.
Whoever needs to leave.
Helena Ernst asked, you mentioned that they were famous for the jazz at his bars. Did he play any instruments? I have no evidence of Thomas playing instruments, but I have evidence of his singing. So I'm assuming that in some way, probably the great tradition of Black choral church music might have impacted him. We know lots of examples of how young people were influenced by singing in church and then went on to continue to sing, as careers. Maybe that's what he was doing. I couldn't find out, although I really tried to, what it was that his music teacher in Manhattan, I know only his last name, Hermann, a German, taught. I really dug through all kinds of contemporary guides to see whether or not he had advertised himself as a voice teacher, a piano teacher, or what. But based on the fact that Thomas's three sons, Michael, and then the youngest ones that I showed at the end by his third wife, all became singers, I'm assuming that that might have been under the father's influence. Michael, the father of the grandson that I met in Paris, in fact, performed spirituals and Russian torch songs in a Russian emigre nightclub in Paris for many years. A place on the right bank that used to exist that was called Scheherazade. Incidentally, he was also an actor. He appeared in dozens of French and foreign movies and TV series, usually in very small bit parts. I actually saw him in one. There's a movie that came out in the 60s, I think, called Paris When It Sizzles, with William Holden and Audrey Hepburn, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a thug who appears in it for a total of about 8 or 9 seconds. That's Frederick, Thomas's son, Michael. I bought a copy of it and gave it to his son, to the grandson in Paris, so he could see it as well. But anyway, the two youngest boys, for a time, tried to make a living as jazz singers in Istanbul when they were left there. So again, it's kind of a roundabout way of trying to find some kind of evidence in support of the idea that he might have been a singer rather than playing any instruments. There are no records of his being a musician in the sense of playing an instrument.
I'm wondering, where did you look for your sources in Constantinople?
Well, I don't know Turkish, and I don't know Ottoman, which is the language that they were using during most of the 20s. So I hired people that were recommended to me to look in archives in Ankara, which is where any relevant archives from Constantinople would have been taken. I hired 2 different people. Both did whatever searches they could, and both said there's nothing. So if it had only been one person, I would have had more doubts. But the only place I found information about him in Turkish sources was in newspapers. I mentioned that French was the second language of Turkey until well into the 1920s. There was a French language newspaper published in Istanbul called Stamboul, and I found a complete run of that newspaper in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. So I looked through that, and I was able to find information about Thomas there because he was a figure of note in the city. When the British were there up through 1923, they published an English language newspaper called the Black Sea News or the Orient News, I forget exactly what. I found it on microfilm, pretty much the complete run. I found mention of Thomas there. The Russians published a bilingual newspaper in Istanbul when they were there between 1920 and 23. There were several 100,000 Russians that passed through the city. Their impact on the city's culture was profound. In fact, there's going to be an exhibit about this in Istanbul once the pandemic disappears, organized by some people at Columbia. That should be very interesting. But in other words, that bilingual Russian-French newspaper also had references to Thomas, and I looked through that. There were other publications that the Russians and the French produced about that period in Istanbul that I found at the Hoover Institution Library in Palo Alto at Stanford. So those are the sources, some of them.
Wow.
But the most exciting part was the archives.
Mm. And the Russian memoristic accounts?
Very little.
Not so much. From what I know, there is not that much.
There isn't much. I mean, I found him mentioned in a couple of memoirs published in the 30s by people who were still active performers before the revolution, but very little. So, for example, I mentioned that the aquarium garden exists in Moscow in truncated form. There was a note on the side of the entrance pillar when I was there last time a few years ago that summarized the history of the place. It doesn't mention Thomas. Maybe, in part because he left. Maybe there was some conscious decision not to inscribe him into the official history of the place.
Yeah, but also I also mean general atmosphere. The Russians in Constantinople.
Oh, he was remembered by them, and fondly, because he was a very charitable fellow. The Russians were really hard up, most of them, as you know. And I found a memoir which mentioned that everybody would try to get employment in a restaurant, among other places, and they would come to Thomas's place. Most of his staff were Russian anyway, and even if you couldn't employ them, at least give them a meal, so that the memory of him among Russian emigres of that wave that passed through Constantinople was a very positive one, because he was generous. He was generous toward his Russian employees as well. One of the innovations of this time was lady waitresses. Under the Ottomans, men were waiters. But with Russians arriving by the thousands, young Russian women became the default waitresses in restaurants. They were also attractive to male customers. And Thomas was very protective of them. People suspected he might be exploiting them. There were investigations carried out. I could talk about this, but it would take too long. But the investigation concluded that no, he is a very protective and generous employer, not exploitative at all.
That's fascinating, because there was such a fear of the white slave traffic, exactly. and especially Russian women in Constantinople from before World War I. A lot of investigative reporting of the dangers to Russian women, and so I would be curious. Is it in the book who did those investigations?
Yeah, it was Admiral Mark Bristol asked an American newspaper reporter to look into it.
Yeah.
And I found a letter in an archive that this reporter wrote. And he concluded, using, of course, the idiom of the age, that his investigation shows that Thomas is the whitest employer in town. You understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
What that term means. Larry Rue is the guy's name, and there was a real stroke of luck to find that letter.
Yeah.
And of course, the imputation was exactly along the lines of what you said. That's what got Mark Bristol to authorize the investigation. Somebody came to, try to stick this on Thomas, and it proved to be completely false.
Yeah. But he was a likely target of those kinds of accusations.
Yes, especially, with the Americans they disliked him simply because he was black. and successful, and
Yeah.
had a white wife. In fact, this is also in the book, but they refused to recognize Elvira, the third wife, as his wife. They thought that he was cohabiting with a white woman.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think this has been fantastic.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book about Savinkov. You say it'll be out later in the fall?
September.
September. Excellent. Who's the publisher?
Pegasus.
Excellent. Congratulations.